The sun rose slow and amber over Redstone Bluff, Texas, the way it always did in the summer of 1883, like it had all the time in the world and knew it. It spilled across the flat scrubland, caught the weather vane atop the Calloway barn, and turned the dust on the main road to a fine, glittering copper. Most mornings, that was the first thing a man noticed riding into town. The second thing he noticed was Rosie Calloway. She was already out at the fence line when the sun crested the ridge, her dark hair pinned loosely beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, passing water buckets to the ranch hands with a laugh that carried clean across the yard. At 28, Rosie Calloway was the kind of woman the frontier seemed to have made on purpose, not softened by it, not broken by it, but shaped by it the way river water shapes stone, into something smooth and strong and quietly beautiful. The men who worked her father's land would have walked barefoot across hot desert rock for her, not because she was the rancher's daughter, but because she treated every one of them like they mattered. "Tommy, that fence post on the south corner is leaning again," she called out, setting down an empty bucket and shading her eyes. Tommy Briggs, 19 and lean as a fence rail himself, grinned from beneath his hat. "I fixed it Tuesday, Miss Rosie. And it's leaning again Thursday. The land doesn't care what day you fixed it." He laughed and went. She always had a way of saying the hard thing so that it never stung. Redstone Bluff itself was a town of maybe 400 souls, planted stubbornly in the middle of nowhere the way frontier towns always were, like someone had dropped a handful of buildings from a great height and decided to call it civilization. There was a general store, a church, a saloon that doubled as a courtroom on Sundays, a blacksmith, and a jailhouse with a hand-painted sign above the door that read Sheriff Colt Maverick. The sheriff's office sat at the far end of the main road, and most days its door was open, because most days Colt Maverick was out in the town doing the job rather than sitting behind a desk, pretending to. He was 32, broad across the shoulder, with a jaw like a barn door and eyes the color of a river at dusk, gray-green and difficult to read until they weren't. He wore his badge the same way he wore everything else, like it was simply part of him and not something put on for show. The people of Redstone Bluff had elected him 3 years running, and the outlaws who had passed through had mostly not passed through a second time. He was fair, and he was firm, and on the rare occasions he was neither of those things, he was fast. That Thursday morning, Colt rode the fence line of the Calloway property on his way back from checking the Eastern Trail, as he often did, a habit he'd built up over years of neighboring the ranch and looking out for old Harold. He slowed his horse when he spotted Rosie at the gate and touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Rosie." "Sheriff." She handed a canteen up to him without being asked because she'd noticed he never carried enough water. He accepted it with the slightly startled look of a man who was never quite prepared for her thoughtfulness. "Your father inside." Resting, a small pause, something crossed her face brief as a cloud shadow. "He's been tired lately." Colt nodded slow. "I'll stop in tomorrow." She watched him ride on. He did not look back, but he adjusted his hat brim in a way that, to anyone paying attention, said more than a sentence would have. Harold Calloway was 61 and had built his ranch from 40 acres and a single herd into the largest cattle operation in the territory. He was a wide, warm man with a white mustache and hands like leather gloves stuffed with stones. He loved his daughter with a plainness and a depth that required no ceremony. Rosie's mother had died when Rosie was 7, and Harold had raised her alone, taught her to ride and read contracts and never sign anything without sleeping on it first. It was therefore a thing that puzzled the whole town when, 8 months prior, Harold had returned from a supply trip to San Antonio with a wife. Her name was Vivienne Holt, now Vivienne Calloway, and she arrived in Redstone Bluff the way a rattlesnake arrives in a henhouse, quietly, and with a great deal of stillness that turned out to be the most dangerous thing about her. She was 40, dark-eyed, dressed in clothes too fine for ranch country, and she smiled at everyone in a way that reached her mouth and stopped precisely there. The town's women distrusted her within a week. The town's men were charmed for about a month before they too began to feel a certain unease they couldn't name. Rosie had tried. She had set a place at the table, offered her hand, said welcome home with every intention of meaning it. But Vivienne had looked at Rosie the very first night with an expression that had nothing welcoming in it. A long, measuring look. The kind a person gives to an obstacle they are already planning to move. 2 weeks before that amber Thursday morning, Harold had called Rosie into his study and told her he'd updated his will. Everything, the land, the cattle, the deed, the savings, passed to Rosie upon his death. The only condition was that she must remain on the property and not abandon the ranch before her 30th birthday. Harold had smiled when he told her, satisfied and certain. Vivienne had been standing in the hallway outside the closed study door. She had heard every word. That same evening, Harold complained of a strange fatigue over supper. He would complain of it again the next night, and the night after that. And 6 days later, on a quiet Wednesday with no wind, Harold Calloway died in his bed, and Redstone Bluff lost the finest man it had ever housed, and Rosie Calloway lost the only soul in the world who had always been entirely, unconditionally on her side. She did not yet know that Vivienne was already writing the letters. She did not yet know what was coming for her. She stood at her father's grave in the churchyard as the sun went down, dry-eyed because she was too deep in grief for tears, and she pressed her hand flat against the headstone and made him a silent promise. "I will keep the land, Papa. I will keep it." 3 days later, the cellar door closed over her head, and the lock turned. The cellar beneath the Calloway ranch house had been built for storing salted meat and root vegetables through the hard winter months. It was 8 feet wide and 10 feet long, with stone walls that wept cold moisture in the evenings and a packed earth floor that smelled of old potatoes and darkness. A single iron ring had been driven into the eastern wall years ago for hanging cured hams. It was to this ring that Vivienne had instructed Silas Dobb to chain Rosie Calloway on the night of the 4th day after Harold's burial. Rosie had not gone quietly. That was the first thing. She had fought with everything she had, scratched, kicked, and called out with a voice that Silas had silenced with a rough hand clamped over her mouth as he dragged her down the cellar steps in the dark. The chain was thick and fastened at her wrists with an iron cuff, long enough that she could sit or stand or lie on the small cot Vivienne had placed there, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. A dead Rosie solved nothing. The will required her absence from the ranch, not her death. So Vivienne kept her alive, kept her fed with 1 meal a day slid through the cellar door on a tin plate, and told the town of Redstone Bluff that poor Rosie, devastated by grief, had packed a bag and ridden out the morning after the funeral without a word to anyone. It was the kind of lie that worked because people wanted it to make sense. Grief did strange things to people. Everyone in Redstone Bluff had seen it before. Everyone except Colt Maverick. He heard the news from the postmaster on a Friday morning, delivered as idle gossip between talk of cattle prices and a broken wagon wheel, and he stood very still in the way he always stood still when something did not add up. Rosie Calloway did not run. That was not the architecture of who she was. He had known her since she was 22 and he was 26, when he'd first ridden into Redstone Bluff with a deputy's badge and a second-hand horse, and in 6 years, he had never once seen her step backward from a hard thing. She had buried her father 4 days ago. She would no sooner have left that land than she would have left her own name behind. He rode out to the Calloway ranch that same afternoon. Silas Dobb met him at the gate. Silas was a wide, flat-faced man who had arrived in Redstone Bluff the same week as Vivienne, which Colt now noted with fresh interest. He wore a gun on each hip and had the particular stillness of a man who had used them before and found it unremarkable. He smiled at Colt with all the warmth of a closed window. "Sheriff, Mrs. Calloway's not receiving visitors today." "I'm not a visitor," Colt said evenly. "I'm the law and I'd like to speak with her." "She's grieving." "So am I." Harold was my friend. I'll keep it brief. There was a long moment in which the two men measured each other with the precision of people who dealt in exactly that kind of measurement. Then Celia stepped aside, just enough, and not an inch more. Vivienne received Colt in the front parlor, dressed in black morning clothes that somehow managed to look expensive. She offered him coffee and condolences in equal measure, and spoke of Rosie with a practiced sadness that almost sounded real. She was so lost without Harold, Vivienne said, pressing a handkerchief to the corner of her dry eye. I tried to reach her, I truly did. But she was gone before dawn. She leave a note. A small pause. She was not in a condition for notes, Sheriff. Take anything with her, clothes, her horse. Another pause, slightly longer. Some things, her mare was gone from the stable. Colt nodded, set down the untouched coffee and thanked her for her time. He rode back to town at an easy pace, thinking hard. That evening he went to the stable and spoke with the stable hand, who confirmed that Rosie's mare, a pale roan named Clover, was stabled and fed and had not been ridden in 5 days. Her saddle was on its rack. Her saddlebag was hanging on the post beside it, still packed with the small things she carried on long rides: a folding knife, a leather journal, a tin of lemon drops she had kept there for years. People who ran away did not leave their horses. He began asking questions quietly, the way good lawmen ask questions, not loudly, not in ways that put people on their guard, but in the small sideways manner of ordinary conversation. He visited the general store, the church, the neighboring farms. People shifted when he asked about the Calloway ranch. Eyes went to doors. Answers came short and quick, the way answers came when a person was afraid of something closer to home than the question being asked. Silas Dobb had been seen riding the boundary lines of the ranch morning and night. He had hired 3 new hands, men no one in Redstone Bluff recognized, and they kept to the ranch and spoke to no one in town. A locked gate had appeared where there had never been one before. The piece that broke it open came on a gray Tuesday morning, 11 days after Rosie had supposedly ridden away. Tommy Briggs found Colt at the jailhouse just before sunrise, his hat twisting in his hands, fear and guilt written plainly across his young face. He reached into his coat and laid a torn piece of fabric on the desk between them, blue cotton with small white flowers, faded from washing. Colt recognized it immediately. He had seen Rosie wearing that dress the last morning he'd ridden past the fence line, the morning she had handed him the canteen without being asked. Where did you find this? Colt asked, his voice carefully level. Tommy swallowed. Caught on the cellar door latch, he said quietly. East side of the ranch house. The door's padlocked from the outside, Sheriff. It's been padlocked since the day after the funeral. The room was very still. Colt picked up the torn cloth and held it for a long moment, and something moved behind his gray-green eyes, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief but contained them both, pressed down and compressed into something harder and more purposeful than either. He set it carefully in his breast pocket, close to his chest. Go home, Tommy, he said. Say nothing to anyone. Tommy nodded and left. Colt reached for his gun belt. Below the earth, in the stone dark of the cellar, Rosie sat against the cold wall with her chained wrists resting in her lap. She had stopped counting days on the wall when she reached 14 marks. Instead, she had turned her attention to the far corner of the cellar, where a loose stone near the base of the wall had revealed, after patient and persistent work, a small hollow, and inside it, a battered iron strongbox, the kind a careful man kept hidden from the world. It was locked, but the key was threaded on a cord around the box's handle, the way a careful man might leave it for someone he trusted to find it. She recognized her father's handwriting on the folded paper tucked beneath the cord. For Rosie, if you are reading this, then I was right to worry. She pressed the paper to her chest in the darkness and closed her eyes, and for the first time since the cellar door had closed above her, she wept not from despair, but from the fierce, aching love of a daughter who understood, finally and completely, that her father had never stopped watching over her, even from a place beyond watching. She did not know that above the earth, boots were already moving. Colt rode out to the Calloway ranch at midnight. He did not go with a posse. He did not go with noise or torchlight or the kind of arrival that gives guilty people time to prepare. He went with his deputy, Ben Holt, steady, quiet Ben, who had been riding alongside Colt for 3 years and had learned to read the set of his jaw the way a sailor reads weather. When Colt had appeared at Ben's door that evening with his gun belt buckled and his eyes carrying that particular compressed stillness, Ben had simply reached for his hat without asking a single question. They came in from the north side, through the scrubland, leaving their horses tied to a drought-bent mesquite tree a quarter-mile from the ranch house. The night was moonless and warm, the kind of Texas dark that felt thick enough to press against, and they moved through it in silence, reading the land the way men read it when they have crossed it enough times to know it by feel. 2 of Silas Dobbs' hired hands were posted at the south gate. Colt and Ben circled wide and came in behind the barn, low and quiet, approaching the east side of the ranch house where Tommy had described the cellar doors. They were exactly as Tommy had said, a pair of heavy wooden doors set flat into the ground at an angle, bound together by a padlock the size of a man's fist. Colt crouched over it, ran his thumb across the lock, and reached into his coat for the iron pry bar he had brought from the jailhouse. Ben kept his eyes on the dark yard around them, hand resting on his holster. It was the creak of a boot on dry earth that warned them. Silas Dobbs stepped out of the shadow of the ranch house with 2 of his men flanking him, rifles loose in their hands, and that flat, cold smile arranged across his face like something painted on. "Awful late for a social call, Sheriff." Colt straightened slowly, the pry bar in his hand, and turned to face him without any visible change in his expression. The 3 men were spread in a loose line. Silas's hand was near his right holster. His 2 men were younger, less certain, watching Colt with the careful attention of people who had heard enough about him to be unsure of themselves. "Step aside, Silas. You got a warrant." "I've got probable cause and a torn piece of a woman's dress pulled off a padlocked cellar door." Colt's voice was entirely conversational. That tended to be enough. Silas's smile did not move. "Mrs. Calloway's not going to appreciate this." "Mrs. Calloway," Colt said, "is going to have considerably larger problems than my appreciation before this night is finished." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and temperature. Silas measured it, measured Colt, measured the deputy standing 6 feet to the left, and made the calculation that men like Silas always eventually make, that the odds were not as comfortable as the smile had suggested. He moved first, fast, going for the holster. Colt was faster. He covered the distance between them in 2 strides and brought the pry bar across in a short, controlled arc that caught Silas's gun hand at the wrist before the weapon cleared leather. The crack was sharp and definitive. Silas made a sound that was not quite a word and staggered, and Colt had him by the collar and face down in the dirt before either of the flanking men had finished deciding what to do. Ben's voice came out of the dark, steady and unhurried, explaining to those 2 men in plain terms that their rifles should be set on the ground, and that this would go better for everyone if they did it slowly. They did it slowly. Ben secured all 3 of them with rope while Colt returned to the cellar doors. He set the pry bar into the padlock hasp and leaned into it with his full weight and the focus of a man who has been waiting 16 days to do exactly this. The hasp gave with a sound like a gunshot, and both doors swung open on the dark below. He descended the stone steps without hesitation. The smell hit him first: cold stone, damp earth, the closed staleness of a space that had been sealed too long. He struck a match and held it up. She was against the far wall. She was sitting upright, back straight against the stone, chin level, the way she had apparently decided she would be found if she was found, not crumpled, not broken, but present. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, her dress torn at the sleeve, her wrists held in iron cuffs connected by a short length of chain to the ring in the wall. She was thinner than 16 days should have made her, which told him the 1 meal a day had not always arrived. Her face, in the matchlight, was pale and drawn and streaked with the evidence of tears long since dried. But her eyes were alive. Completely, fiercely, defiantly alive. She looked at him across the dark cellar and said nothing for a moment. Then her voice came out steady, if rough from disuse. "Took you long enough, Sheriff." Something moved across Colt's face that he did not have a name for. He crossed the cellar floor in 4 steps, crouched before her, examined the cuffs, and pulled a ring of keys from his coat pocket. He had collected them from Sela's during the brief, efficient process of putting him on the ground. The 3rd key turned. The cuffs fell open. Rosie looked down at her freed wrists for a moment, and the steadiness she had maintained cracked just slightly at the edges, a sharp intake of breath, quickly controlled. She held out the strongbox. "My father hid this," she said. "There's a letter." He knew Colt. He knew what she was. Colt took the box and tucked it under his arm. Then he put the keys away, and without a word, he slid one arm beneath her knees and one behind her back and lifted her from the cellar floor. She made a small sound of protest. "I can walk," and he said simply, "I know you can," and carried her up the steps and out into the night air anyway. She went still in his arms when the air hit her face. She turned her face upward and simply breathed, long and slow and deep. And the night sky above Redstone Bluff was nothing remarkable, just the same flat Texas dark with its scatter of cold stars. But she looked at it the way a person looks at something they had begun to believe they might never see again. Colt held her and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. By morning, Vivienne Calloway stood before the town judge in the Redstone Bluff courtroom with Harold's original land deed on the table, and his handwritten letter read aloud before every soul in town. The forged documents crumbled under examination. The signature inconsistencies alone were damning, and when the bribed lawyer was brought forward and shown the evidence against him, his cooperation was immediate and complete. Vivienne's composure, so long and carefully maintained, came apart in stages, like a fine dress in hard rain. She and Sela's were put in irons before noon. The town of Redstone Bluff watched in silence as the woman who had locked Rosie Calloway in a cellar was led past the very gate Rosie now stood beside, cleaned, rested, fed, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, standing on her own land in the morning sun. Rosie did not say anything to Vivienne as she passed. She did not need to. The land stretched out behind her, golden and enormous and entirely hers. Colt stood beside her, hat in hand, turning it slowly by the brim in that way he had when words were forming in him that he wasn't yet sure how to release. She waited because she had always been good at waiting for things worth having. "I should have come sooner," he said finally. "You came," she said. He looked at her for a long, unguarded moment, the kind of look he had never quite allowed himself before, in all the years of hat brims and canteens and fence-line conversations. "Rosie," he said, "I intend to come for you for the rest of my life if you'll allow it." The morning light was on her face. She looked back at him with those steady, clear eyes, and something in them softened, not into weakness, but into the particular warmth of a person who has endured the worst and arrived, finally, at the best. "I'll allow it," she said. 3 weeks after Vivienne Calloway was taken in irons down the Redstone Bluff road, the old oak tree behind the Calloway ranch house was doing what it always did in late summer, standing enormous and unhurried against the sky, its thick branches throwing shade across the dry grass below in patterns that shifted slowly with the afternoon wind. It was beneath this tree that Colt Maverick got down on one knee. He had no speech prepared. That was not his way. He held a simple silver ring, one stone, pale blue as a winter sky, bought from the traveling jeweler who passed through Redstone Bluff twice a year, and he looked up at Rosie, standing in the oak's shade with her arms loosely crossed and her head tilted, watching him with an expression that suggested she had been expecting this, and had decided to let him do it properly anyway. "I am not a man of great words," Colt began. "I know," she said. "I have a jailhouse, a good horse, and about $40 saved. I know that too. And I have spent 6 years riding past your fence line looking for reasons to slow down." He paused. "Rosie Calloway, I would like to stop pretending those reasons were ever about the fence." She looked at him for a long, warm moment, the oak shifting its light across them both, and then she reached down and took the ring from his hand before he could place it, turned it once between her fingers examining the pale blue stone, and said with complete composure, "Yes, Colt. Obviously yes." He laughed a real laugh, the rare unguarded kind, and stood, and when he put the ring on her finger they were both quiet for a moment beneath the old tree, as though the land itself was listening and they were willing to let it. The wedding of Sheriff Colt Maverick and Rosie Calloway took place on a Saturday morning in the first week of September, in the white church at the center of Redstone Bluff, and the entire town came. Every soul came, the ranchers and the ranch hands, the storekeepers and the blacksmith, the schoolteacher and the postmaster, the women who had distrusted Vivienne from the first week, and the men who had been too afraid of Cellar to speak up and who had come today partly in celebration, and partly in the quiet, unspoken way of people making something right. Tommy Briggs stood near the front in a clean shirt with his hat pressed to his chest, looking like a young man who understood that he had done something that mattered. Deputy Ben Holt stood beside Colt at the altar with the patient dignity of a man honored to be exactly where he was. Rosie came down the aisle in a white dress that had belonged to her mother, taken in and altered by 3 women of the town who had spent 4 evenings doing it and refused any payment. Her dark hair was down and threaded through with small wildflowers, blue sage and yellow daisy, and 1 sprig of white prairie clover, and she walked without being given away because the land she walked from was already hers, and she belonged to no one and was choosing freely. She reached Colt at the altar and he looked at her the way he had looked at her under the oak tree, openly, without the careful management he usually applied to his expressions, and the preacher had to clear his throat twice before either of them remembered where they were. The vows were simple, spoken in steady voices. The ring was placed. The town of Redstone Bluff exhaled collectively, as towns do when something that should have happened finally does. Outside the church, in the bright September morning, there was food laid on long tables and a fiddle player who knew 30 songs and played all of them before the afternoon was done. Children ran between the tables. Old ranchers told Harold Calloway stories that made Rosie laugh and press her hand to her heart in equal measure. Colt stood beside his wife, that word settling into him with the solid, permanent weight of something true, and accepted congratulations with a handshake and a nod, and watched Rosie move through the celebration with a fullness in his chest that he would not have known how to describe and did not try. The rider arrived the following morning. He came from the territorial capital, his horse dusty from hard riding, carrying a leather satchel with a territorial seal pressed into the flap. He asked for Rosie Maverick by name at the jailhouse door, which made Colt pause for half a second at the newness of it before stepping aside to let her forward. The documents were laid on the desk between them. Rosie read them once, quickly, then sat down and read them again slowly. Colt read over her shoulder, and the room was very quiet except for the sound of pages turning, and the distant fiddle still playing faintly from the celebration winding down in the street outside. Harold Calloway, the documents explained, had purchased a second tract of land 11 years prior, 40,000 acres of open territory to the west, held in a private trust under a name his lawyer had established for exactly this purpose. The trust transferred automatically and entirely to Rosie upon her marriage to a man of legal standing in the territory. Harold had written the condition himself. He had apparently decided that the kind of man his daughter would choose to marry was precisely the kind of man he would want holding land beside her. Rosie set the page down. She picked up the second document. This one bore the seal of the Territorial Land Commissioner, and it was dated 7 years earlier. Harold Calloway had commissioned a geological survey of the Calloway Ranch property and the surrounding land quietly, without announcement, after a passing surveyor had mentioned, over supper one evening, certain rock formations he had seen before. The survey results, kept sealed in the commissioner's office per Harold's specific written instruction, were to be released to Rosie upon proof of marriage. The Calloway land, both tracts, sat above one of the largest silver deposits recorded in the territory of Texas. Harold had filed the mining claim in Rosie's name 7 years ago. It had been sitting there ever since, sealed and patient and waiting, the way her father had always been patient and waiting on her behalf. Rosie read the final page and set it flat on the desk. The room was very still. Colt spoke first, his voice carefully measured. "Rosie." "He knew," she said. Her voice was quiet. "He knew about the land, he knew about the silver, and he knew someone might try to take it from me. He built walls around me that I couldn't even see." She pressed her fingers flat against the documents. "He planned all of this, all of it." She stood and went to the window and looked out at the main road of Redstone Bluff. The church, the store, the blacksmith, the families still gathered in the warm September morning, and something moved through her that was too large and too layered for a single name. Grief and gratitude and love, and the particular ache of understanding a parent completely only after they are gone. Colt came and stood beside her at the window. He did not reach for words because there were none sufficient. He simply stood with her, shoulder to shoulder, the way he intended to stand for the rest of his life. After a long moment, Rosie turned from the window. "We are going to build a schoolhouse," she said, with the tone of someone making a decision that has already been fully formed, "and a proper doctor's office. And I want the Miller family's debt cleared. They've been struggling since the drought." She paused. "The silver can do all of that and still leave more than we will ever need." Colt looked at her with those gray-green eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing to add. That evening they rode up to the ridge above the ranch as the sun descended behind the western land, the new land, their land, 40,000 acres of it stretching gold and open into the distance. The original ranch spread below them, the town of Redstone Bluff small and warm and alive in the early evening light, smoke rising from chimneys, lamplight beginning in windows. Rosie sat on Clover beside Colt's gray horse, and the wind moved through the grass below in long, slow waves that made the whole land appear to breathe. "Papa knew," she said softly. Colt reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. His grip was steady and unhurried, the grip of a man who has found the place he intends to remain. The frontier stretched before them, endless, golden, entirely theirs. Behind them, the town they would build something in. Beside them, each other. And somewhere beneath the good Texas earth, a quiet fortune that a careful, loving father had planted years ago like a seed in secret soil, certain in the way only the best fathers are certain, that his daughter would survive whatever came for her, find her way to the light, and be exactly ready when it bloomed.